This is the most exciting part of the book, and I have to start over because it just froze. Okay, here we go. This is chapter 17. Dawn broke slowly. A cold breeze moved through the brush, but the valley below us was shrouded in mist. We had kept logs burning through the night, and having saddled the horses and put everything in readiness, we waited around the fire. Don Andres said to me, pointing down the valley, "Over against the hill is a clump of oaks." He waited until I made them out through the mist. "Take 7 horses and ride now and quickly. Tether the horses there in the trees, as much as possible out of the sight of the enemy." He paused and glanced over at my stallion. "It might be better if you ride something easier to handle. One of the spare geldings, say." "I can handle the stallion," I said. "In battle?" "Anywhere," I said, though I was not sure. "In battle or out of battle?" "Very well," Don Andres said, giving me a curious look. "Buena suerte." "Thank you, sir, for your wish of good luck," I said. "Por nada," Don Andres said. The 7 horses we tied one to the other. I said goodbye to my father and led the horses at a quick trot out of the camp to the clump of trees against the hill. The sun shone somewhere beyond the mountain rim, but here below the mist was cold and heavy. I sat on Tiburon and kept my eyes on the place, which was close by, where the trail led out of the canyon. Far off I could see the fire of our camp and the men standing around it. I heard no sound, nothing, as the first gringo rode out of the brush. He was seated on a small gray horse, and he had braid on his hat and on his shoulders. He held the reins in one hand. A scabbard and sword hung from his saddle horn. I had no idea then, as he rode slowly past me, that he was General Kearney of the American Army. From where I stood under the oak trees on a little rise, the valley stretched before me. On my right hand was the narrow ravine down which General Kearney came, and his officers and men would come. The ravine led into a valley off to my left, and was about 3 leagues in length and about a league in width, shallow and rolling. A stream that wandered through it was marked by willows and sycamore trees. Across the valley where we had camped that night, I saw our men run for their horses. Before the officer on the gray gelding had gone more than a dozen steps, they rode out of the camp and raced at a hard gallop away from him, down the valley. More officers now came into view, riding in single file. Among them I recognized the man on the spotted horse who had stopped at Dos Hermanos, Lieutenant Carson. With Don Andres and Don Roberto in the lead, our men were fleeing, or so I thought. I guess the gringos thought so too, for at once they set off in pursuit. By now the first of the soldiers had ridden out of the canyon. Their horses looked scrawny and tired. The soldiers stopped to gaze at the valley, then at their officers in pursuit of the fleeing Californians. But as the soldiers stood there at the mouth of the ravine, the Californians suddenly turned and rode back, still at a gallop in a wide sweep along the far side of the valley, near the hill that was covered with cactus. This proved to be a ruse. It was to make the gringos think that our band was in flight. The gringo officers pulled up their horses, not knowing what to expect. They did not know whether to follow the Californians or to stand where they were. Then the Californians wheeled and galloped down among the standing officers. I heard the voice of Don Andres Pico. "Santiago, and at them!" he shouted. This was the battle cry of the Spaniards, who drove the Moors from Spain. A gringo captain yanked at his sword, but he found that the sword was rusted in its scabbard. He drew a pistol and shouted at the officers who stood facing the oncoming lancers. I heard the thud of a musket, the one that belonged to Martinez. The shot struck the captain, and he fell from the saddle. I saw Lieutenant Carson, the man who had come to the ranch asking for food. He raised his rifle to use as a club. General Kearney, who stood near him, was struck by a lance and dropped to the ground. Most of the gringo officers were now on the ground, pierced by the steel-tipped lances. The Californians swept past. I looked for my father, but I did not see him. Don Roberto raised his hand and waved to me. I still did not see my father. The lancers galloped hard for the lower part of the valley. A second group of men rode out of the canyon. These were gringo soldiers, not officers. They charged toward the battlefield in the meadow where the officers sprawled in the grass. The soldiers saw our lancers fleeing westward down the valley. They raised their rifles and set off to pursue them. They had not gone far when the lancers quickly wheeled, as they had done once before, and galloped back upon the soldiers. The soldiers, like the officers, now found that their rifles had rusted in the rain and would not shoot. Well, that is super lucky, isn't it? They raised them, thank heavens for fog. They raised them to use as clubs, but our men struck hard with the long, deadly lances. A horn sounded. More soldiers rode out from the canyon, and a wounded officer rallied them and retreated toward the hill that was covered with cactus. I could no longer see the lancers. I was now alone at the far side of the meadow. The place where the battle was fought was strewn with soldiers. Some of them lay quiet in the grass, and some cried for help. The battle had been brief. It had only taken a few minutes. Lying dead before me there in the wet grass, I was soon to know, were almost 20 men of General Kearny's army, and as many wounded. Not until much later, long after the Battle of San Pascual, did we learn about the Gringo soldiers, where they had come from, and what they had planned to do. The blonde Gringo who had stopped at Dos Hermanos for food, Lieutenant Kit Carson, was with them. He was their guide and scout. When Lieutenant Carson left Dos Hermanos, so we learned, and rode east with his message for President Polk, he met General Kearny a few leagues west of Santa Fe in New Mexico. He told the general that the war in California was over. The Spaniards hadn't fought and wouldn't fight, and were just a passel of old women. General Kearny partly believed Kit Carson and sent 2/3 of his troops back to Santa Fe. He had orders to ride out to California and subdue the Spaniards, so he set out with 110 men for San Diego. He took Kit Carson with him, though Carson wanted to see his wife in Taos and take his message to President Polk. They had traveled along the Devil's Highway and climbed the high mountains towards Agua Caliente. The men became exhausted, and most of the mules and horses sickened and died. At Agua Caliente, General Kearny had rested his men and caught more horses and started down the mountain for San Diego. It was there that our paths had joined. These things we heard much later, after the bloody battle of San Pascual had long been over. So we will stop there.